Next on the Capital Cable, U.S. China economic trade relationship, impact on the Korean Peninsula, impact in the region, impact on the world. All that and much more next on the Capital Cable. All right, good morning to those of you in Washington. Good evening to those of you in Korea. Good afternoon to those of you like Victor in Spain. And welcome to the CSIS Capital Cable, I believe the 112th installment. Don't quote me on that though. However, this week on the Capital Cable, U.S. China economic relationship. We'll go bigger, we'll go broader, we'll go deeper. We'll cover Asia. We'll cover the political. We'll cover it all here today in 45 minutes. And with us, perfectly positioned to talk about this, with two of the foremost experts, maybe even the foremost experts on China, Dr. Evan Medeiros and Dr. Zoe Liu. And let me introduce them formally to bring them into the show here. I, by the way, am Mark Lippert, your host and moderator. Let me start with Dr. Medeiros. Dr. Medeiros is the Penner Family Chair in Asia Studies at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. He's also the Kling Family Distinguished Fellow in U.S. China Studies. Prior to that, a long and distinguished track record, both in and out of policy, but most notably NSC, Senior Director and Director, covering China and all things Asia in the Obama administration. Worked at the Rand Institute, especially in the Santa Monica office in the winter. Was a policy advisor to the Secretary of Treasury, 2007-2008. Also works as a senior advisor to the Asia Group as well. Education credentials, impeccable. LSE, PhD, Cambridge Masters, and Bates, where my nephew goes, BA. Evan, Dr. Medeiros, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Mark. Thanks for having me.
All right, outstanding. All right. Next up, certainly not necessarily lower in the batting order. Just we put her in the batting order to use a KB over. It's where we have some people on base where she can drive in. We have Dr. Zoe Liu, the Maurice R. Greenberg Senior Fellow for China Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations. Prior to that, a unbelievable distinguished academic career, including, and I'm not going to get them all in here, assistant professor at Texas A&M, the Bush School. She was also at NYU, Fletcher for some postdoc work, I believe, in and out of policy work, also at the IMF, worked at SICE, all sorts of publications, a real focus on the political economy. We're lucky to get her for this episode here. Political economy, supply chain, all of the rich tapestry that we're gonna, again, weave here today. PhD, Johns Hopkins. She has a master's degree from Georgetown University and her bachelor's degree from a very famous institute in China as well. Dr. Liu, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, outstanding. And it's timely. We've got both of you here today. You both did something on Russia recently, the Russia-China relationship. So we're going to get to that in a second, pick up where we left off. But let me dive in first, and I guess I'll go with Evan first. Let's go big picture to both of you to start this episode here. Two things. One, state of the overall bilateral relationship, right? We've got a whole multifaceted basically issue set to dive into there, number one. And number two, the general framework in the region, especially vis-a-vis with the entry of the Trump administration. Big stuff to start. Evan, why don't you take the first one, and then I'm going to come to Dr. Liu.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Well, I'm going to start with the regional, start with big picture, and then go bilateral. So in terms of the region, this is, I mean, the trade war, Trump's policy is basically an earthquake for the entire region. And there's one very simple reason why. That U.S. policy, or I should say U.S. strategy toward Asia, going back to the 1950s, was not just predicated on alliances. Of course, that's what most scholars and policymakers like to focus on. And obviously, these alliances have been important and remain central to U.S. strategy. But U.S. strategy toward the region has always been a hybrid political economic strategy. In other words, it's not just about providing security assurances, it's also about providing access to the U.S. market. So the U.S. market as a source of final demand has been central to the whole growth story of Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, and of course, China, but also access to American capital, American investment in East Asia, East East Asian investment in the United States. So essentially, the openness of the U.S. economy, both as a source of supply and source of demand, has been central to weaving together this hybrid political economic strategy in which Asian policymakers see their interests and their future as intimately tied with the United States. Now, of course, Trump's entire strategy has basically put a stick of dynamite in the center of the bargain that's inherent in this political economic strategy, because it raises the question about whether or not you can get access to the U.S. market. It has raised questions about whether or not companies in East Asia, Japanese, Korean, etc., actually want to and can invest in the United States. And so regionally, I think it's raised all sorts of questions about whether or not this hybrid strategy, this political economic strategy, will persist going forward. In terms of the bilateral U.S. China relationship, the sources of friction are obvious. Now, in broad terms, the U.S. China relationship is one of strategic competition. That's not new, that's not surprising, it's not terribly interesting. But what is more interesting is the fact that the strategic competition is really one of broad spectrum competition. In other words, we compete in four arenas: security, economics, technology, and questions of ideology. And in each one of those arenas, not just economics, the competition has been expanding, it's been intensifying, and it's been diversifying. Now, of course, there's a very, very heavy focus on the economic relationship today because of the trade war. But what's important to know about this sort of broad spectrum competition is that it is not compartmentalizable. In other words, whereas in the past, an economic issue could remain an economic issue, it's not clear that that's going to happen today. And so when we think about the economic relationship between the United States and China, and the fact that we now have these big trade negotiations that appear to be starting in Geneva in a day or so, we should really think about them less as just a technocratic trade negotiation, but really as the central venue for adjudicating the contours, negotiating the contours of what the strategic competition will be. So for those of you in the audience that are familiar with the history of the international relations of the last 80 years, the trade negotiations that are going on now are similar in quality to the arms control negotiations between the US and the Soviets during the 70s and the 80s, in the sense that they are very rapidly becoming the central venue through which the contours of strategic competition will be negotiated. Over to you, Mark.
All right, outstanding, Evan. Let me just come back on one point to tease you out here. It's an interesting one, and it just gets to the self-interest question. Your discussion of the, I guess, the historic nature of the U.S. policy in terms of its hybrid components, political and economics, access to the market, that was devised by what I would call a bunch of ruthless, self-interested Cold Warriors, right? Who did this out of both interest in the United States, but also interest in the global system, right? And so and those two items were interlocked. Is the Trump administration, just to put a I guess to underscore it, basically making the argument that those two things are not linked anymore in this new world order, for lack of a better term, we find ourselves in today?
Yeah, look, the Trump administration is effectively implementing a hostile takeover of the rules-based order, right? And so they're blowing up the WTO system that existed. And by WTO system, what I'm referring to is the simple idea, as complex in implementation as it is, but the simple idea that trade should be rule-based. Because if it's not rule-based, you basically have everybody pursuing their own interests. And so the difference between the Trump administration and previous administrations is they apparently don't believe that trade should be rule-based, and so they're just pursuing U.S. interests unilaterally, which is raising all sorts of questions about what rules, what norms, what institutions will guide trade in goods and services. So, to your point, Mark, yes, I mean, there's a fundamentally different set of ideas in the current U.S. leadership about the future. Remember, though, that this hybrid bargain that I talked about was not just um, forged in Washington. There were counterparts in Tokyo, in Seoul, in Beijing, in other parts of Asia that wanted access to the US market, wanted access to American capital. And, that was when Japan, Korea were very poor countries, trying to move up the developmental curve. That's not the issue today, right? I mean, Japan, Korea, Singapore, Indonesia. I mean, these are, very, very advanced economies that have lots of options in terms of where to deploy their capital, who to trade with. So, yes, access to the US market is important for a variety of reasons, but the question always comes up, at what price, at what cost?
No, very good stuff. All right, Evan. Yeah, and just final, I'm going to come to Dr. Elliott. Just a comment from me is on your first part of your intervention is that the ideological part of the U.S. China relationship might be going through some changes as well, given that the rules-based order itself is not, I guess, would say as primal or as critical. Seemingly to the Trump administration, at least in terms of some elements of it. So interesting stuff there. All right, Dr. Over to you. Same set of questions. Your characterization of the U.S.-China relationship, where things are headed. Obviously, we've got Evan mentioned the trade discussions, which I would say puts more in terms of a summit almost negotiation. You've got the visit of Xi Jinping to Moscow. Lots going on, lots to unpack. Please unpack it for us.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. To just piggyback on Evan's earlier point, I'd say that the rise of China and the transformation of the Chinese economy from one of the poorest countries in the world to the second largest economy, and by some measures, especially by PPP measures, the Chinese economy is the number one in the world. A lot of this has changed not just how the U.S. views China, but also how Chinese leaders demand how China being perceived and being treated. And I think this speaks to a lot of President Xi Jinping's approach to handle not just China's domestic affairs, but also China's relationship with the United States and with other countries. And related to this, I think Evan mentioned great that the U.S. approach to Asia region has been a mix of both economic and security approaches. So here, the rise of China challenges or complicates both. On the one hand, you have China's military buildup, which put a lot of countries in the neighborhood not uneasy. And then on the other hand, the rise of the Chinese economy, especially the rise of the value chain-based international trade, basically means that now you have China sitting at the center of a global value chain, and which means countries that are militarily or on the security wise more dependent on the United States, but economically they are more reliant upon China. And by the way, the Chinese leaders always say that, well, China today is the largest trading partner of over 120 countries in the world. So obviously, you would naturally see the Chinese leaders or Chinese diplomats and the Chinese companies even started to see their own relevance to global market. And this is also perhaps the background when people talk about the leverage that China may have. Not in the early days, it's over Korea and Japan, and now in the current U.S. China tension.
Okay.
And back to you, Mark.
Oh, fantastic. Let's dive a little deeper. Let's take it one step down. You framed the Chinese thinking, and you framed some leverage points that Beijing has in the current, you'd say, global economic system. Take us to today. We've got this trade negotiations upcoming in Switzerland, number one. Number two, huge tariffs, and much has been made about the impact on the Chinese economy, right? And then three, these other countries that you talked about, traditional security allies of the U.S., also impacted by tariffs from Washington in their own right, but also through the, I guess you'd say, the externalities of the quote unquote trade war between the U.S. and China. So let's unpack some of those elements here in terms of how are the Chinese thinking about these issue sets going forward and heading into these negotiations?
I think the bottom line is that neither the United States nor China wants a trade war for obvious reasons, right? And on the Chinese side, they recognize that the Chinese economy remains very much dependent on export, although export share of the Chinese GDP growth has steadily declined from the peak of almost a third of the Chinese GDP, now is less than 1/5 or stabilized around 18 to 20%. And out of this, the US and EU market combined remain the single largest export destination. So despite a lot of these conversations about China and like in policy and academic world people, there are a set of research showing that China actually initiating some of those decoupling or de-risking methods. Despite all this, the Chinese market remains very much heavily dependent on the West. But here, the flip side of this basically is the same as oil exporting countries. Major oil exporters, they need consumers. And this is the same for Chinese exporters. And in this context, the Chinese, perhaps, if I know this, probably Xi Jinping and his policy advisors knows this, which is that at least in the short run, the inventory levels in the United States gives China the leverage. And the reason of this is very simple. It's just logistics. So think about it. Like for a container ship to come over from the Chinese port to the United States, it takes about somewhere between 20 days or so. And then it takes another 1 or 2 weeks for the container ships to get on a truck and then being distributed through highways or freights to American consumers and the factories. So what we are really saying is that China, in the US, our just-in-time inventory management approach, it was great before COVID. It was great when the United States and China was not in this relatively contentious relationship. We don't have to worry about supply chain disruptions. We don't have to worry about a tariff resulted in container ships stop coming to the United States. But as a result of a lot of the geopolitical issue, as well as heightened tariff tension, it basically means that America's wholesale inventory level is about 40 to 50 days. So from that perspective, Chinese leaders probably are very much aware that at least in the short run, they have the upper hand against the United States because the US are going to experience, US consumers and factories are going to experience a shortage in industrial inputs, empty shelves and all that. So from that perspective, that is the short-term leverage on the Chinese side. But in the broader scheme, as the reduction in purchasing order and a lot of shrinking export is going to have domestic ramifications from factory consolidation, leading to unemployment, leading to the building up of a social pressure. So this is sort of why I argue that neither side would want the trade tension. And related to that, China also augmented its approach, its capacity to retaliate against the US coercive policies, from sanctions to tariffs. So over the past 5 years, China basically strengthened its export control regime. And in fact, Evan has written about export control regime, especially in the context of military goods. But in this round, it's really about the dual use product. And in the Chinese export control law implemented in 2020, China introduced this extraterritoriality clause, which basically gives them the flexibility to not just directly restrict export controls to US users, but also third-party countries who might eventually ship Chinese product or Chinese component to the US. In other words, this put countries like Korea, like Japan, or for that matter, Southeast Asian economies in a difficult position, or for that matter, it creates a compliance dilemma for global companies.
No, outstanding. All right, and I guess a gross oversimplification, they've created their own foreign direct product rule in many respects. All right, but one last follow-up, then I want to bring Evan. I want to bring you. I want to take it one level down in terms of granularity. Both sides don't want a trade war. There's leverage calculations that you mentioned. So what are some must-haves for Beijing? What do they want to get out of this negotiation in terms of basically outcomes that would help their economy and help their positioning geopolitically?
I think from my conversation with visiting Chinese academics and policy people, as well as when I went back to China, they keep asking me this one question: what is the end goal of President Trump or the Trump administration? So from my reading of that question is that they care less about tactical economic issues, but they want something at the more strategic level. And of course, the issue, the sovereignty issue of the island of Taiwan is perhaps the one of the most important, if not the most critical bottom lines that the Communist Party of China would want to clarify.
All right, outstanding. All right, Evan, over to you. First, comments on any of the previous intervention would be most welcome here. If I could try to direct you, which is a difficult task on a good day, but let me just, same question to you in terms of what the Chinese want out, and then it would be great to hear your answer to the Chinese question about what the Trump administration wants out of all of this as well. But Evan, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So what do the Chinese want? I think this is a critical question, and I think Zoe's answer is excellent. But just to reinforce the point, I think the Chinese basically...
My answer is excellent, by the way, whenever we're on a panel together. What's going on? Anyway, I digress. All right, let's get going. All right, sorry.
The Chinese want two things. First, they want tariff relief, right? The 125 level, the 145 level, or 145% tariffs implemented by the U.S., 125% implemented by China. Totally unsustainable. They know that. That's why they effectively dropped their precondition for talks, which is where we are today. So they want to use this process beginning in Geneva to produce substantial reduction in tariffs. That's the first and the most important thing they want. If they achieve that, then I think what they want is a negotiation process that allows them to play for time. I think that they understand that Trump doesn't really know what he wants, right? The Chinese have been engaging the Trump administration since the day after the election, and they've always asked the same thing, which is, what does Trump want? And they haven't gotten an answer, and they're very, very frustrated by that. And of course, the reason they haven't gotten an answer is because there's a range of opinions in the Trump administration. There are at least 3 or 4 different schools of thought about how to approach the China challenge. They haven't had a great internal debate that have reconciled these different schools of thought. And so as a result, I think the Chinese have come to the conclusion that if they can get into a negotiation that allows them to at least push off the prospect of further punitive competitive action on the part of the Trump administration, maybe wait until after the midterm, hope that the Trump administration or the Republican Party suffers defeat in the midterm, and then use that to wait out the administration toward the future. I'm not convinced this strategy makes sense. I'm not convinced it's going to work, but I think it is something that's informing the way that Beijing is thinking about it.
Evan, back on a two-finger really quickly and just ask you to clarify. Could you give us the 3 or 4 schools of thought that the Trump administration has on this, and would a negotiation likely force or have any impact in trying to force the reconciliation of views that you mentioned previously?
Look, the most popular parlor game in Washington these days, Mark, is what are the schools of thought in the Trump administration on issue X. So, of course, as a China specialist, I'm in the middle of that conversation about China policy. Uh, and I'm sure Zoe will have her own take on what the schools of thought are. But my basic take is number one, Donald Trump himself, who clearly likes Xi Jinping, respects him, wants to talk with him, wants to do big deals with him because that's what you do. He's focused much more on economic issues than security issues. Number two is a group of, let's call them, for lack of a better term, sort of cold warriors. These would be based at the National Security Council and the State Department, certainly Mike Waltz and Marco Rubio, and they very much adhere to the school of thought captured in a very provocative, very thoughtful article by Matt Pottinger and Mike Gallagher, where they basically say the U.S. should run the Cold War strategy it ran against the Soviet Union against China. Then you have a group of economic nationalists, Peter Navarro, Jameson Greer, that are principally focused on reindustrialization and using tariffs and other tools to reindustrialize. A school of thought that's not necessarily inconsistent or incompatible with the others. And then there's a fourth school of thought, a bit more inchoate, that I would argue is focused on strategic restraint. In other words, we need to avoid going to war with China. We need to find a way to talk with them, negotiate with them on a whole variety of issues. You see this school of thought bubbling up around some of the sort of MAGA loyalists, some of the folks at the Defense Department. It's a school of thought that seems to be very focused on the concept of strategic restraint, asking the question, should we go to war with China over Taiwan, for example? Again,
it's bubbled up in some of the other foreign policy areas more acutely, right? Like Europe, Ukraine, et cetera.
Yeah,
Middle
exactly.
East.
Yeah, you see, you could argue that the vice president and advisors are around Vice President J.D. Vance. Again, as I said, it's a bit more inchoate, but nonetheless, there's a series of ideas there that inform strategy toward China. So could the negotiations with China force a reconciliation? It's possible, but of course, the trade negotiations are focused on economic issues, not security issues. So it's not clear how much the sort of strategic restraint school comes into play. It also depends on the scope of what these talks are. I mean, one of the points that I often make to my students, Mark, here at Georgetown, is there's a very important distinction that was used during the Cold War, the distinction between talks and negotiations. Negotiations being a much more formal mechanism, talks being, I mean, as the word implies, we're having a discussion. And so I think what's going to be happening in Geneva, I think they're in Geneva, I know they're in Switzerland, is they're going to be talking about A, the agenda, and B, the process. So what they're doing is they're sort of setting the table for what would be a more formal negotiation. So I think that's effectively where we are today, is we're at the beginning of the beginning. We're focused on talks, not negotiations. These talks are to set the table for what would be a more formal negotiation. Now, Secretary of Treasury Bessent has said publicly that he thinks about this in 3 stages. Stage 1 is, or I should say, he thinks about negotiations in 3 stages. Stage 1 is tariff relief. Stage 2 is Chinese purchases of American goods. So phase 1 trade deal redux from the first Trump administration. And then the third part would be sort of the structural imbalances in the relationship. So these talks, I think, are really about seeing if we can get the Chinese to agree to that kind of agenda, and and do they agree to focus on tariff relief first, then to focus on process, who are going to be the counterparts on both sides, But I think it's important to remember this is going to take a lot of time. Neither Besant nor Hulifeng, his Chinese counterpart, have any experience in this kind of negotiation. Both sides face an enormous amount of political pressure. Both sides are going to be very, very careful. And I mean, Mark, you know, in the Obama administration, we did a lot of negotiation with the Chinese on a whole variety of things: Iran, North Korea, trade issues, etc. The Chinese are very, very methodical in the way they do things. So this meeting in Switzerland will be what we in the Obama administration like to call an artillery exchange of talking points, right? And so the Chinese will come, Hulifeng will come with a very anodyne set of talking points approved by the Politburo Standing Committee, and he is only going to, you know, and he will only stay within very, very narrow boundaries. So this is a process that's going to take time. It's going to be very, very sequential. And so the question is, you know, who feels a greater sense of urgency because of economic dislocation, the Americans or the Chinese, and how to leader level interactions play into this. You know, do we have a couple rounds of talks that ultimately culminate in a phone call between Trump and Xi Jinping that then kick off more formal negotiations, which start with tariff relief, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of different permutations, lots of exciting things for your listeners to think about. Over to you, Mark.
All right, excellent, outstanding. So you're saying a breakthrough's coming? Just kidding. All right, I like the artillery. All right, Zoe, over to you. Let me pick up. I'm going to lift and shift because we've really, I think, drilled down on these negotiations. But feel free, any final comments here? We're running out of time. We've got about 10 minutes. But I want to bring in a couple of points that you raised earlier, and I bookmarked. But I want to bring in export controls, Taiwan, and a little bit on the role of friends and allies. Big topics. And of course, we've got about 10 minutes. Let's talk about export controls. Where do they fit in all of this in terms of, is this something that is likely to be on the negotiating table? There's been a lot of chatter about the president being indifferent, the Chinese really wanting this off. I think let's start there, and then if you would address the Taiwan question in and around all of this economic swirl as well.
You know, Mark, export control matters in the context of the rise of economic security, not just for countries like China, but for the United States and the U.S. allies. And this speaks a lot to China or Chinese companies, Chinese factories, Chinese manufacturing capacity in global supply chain. You know, just the number that we probably many of us and the listeners probably are familiar with is that China's manufacturing output is about 30% of the global. And the U.S. is less than half of what the Chinese has. But that 30% basically means that China's manufacturing capacity is bigger than the combination of U.S., Korea, Japan, and Germany and France, adding all together. So this for China, obviously, it speaks to China's manufacturing power, but then on the other hand, it also speaks to the other side, which basically contributed directly to the rising tariff tension, if you will, which is this this word that maybe Chinese leaders and scholars don't like, but it's the reality, which is industrial overcapacity, right? So it's in this bigger context. Now, China's export control resides on China basically dominates global supply chain on a whole wide range of issues, and B, China's dominance is also critical in industries that matters for the future and industries that matters for national security, especially military industrial complex. Like when American drone makers depend on the Chinese critical minerals, you know, we have a problem, right? So from that perspective, over the past few years, China augmented its export control regime by adding and putting more emphasis on dual use goods, because for a period of time since the 80s, export control regime is more in the context of non-proliferation and arms control. But now this round, it's very much laser focused on dual use. And when we talk about dual use, this gives the Chinese policymakers as well as export control influencers, if you will, because you need experts to assess what is dual use, what is not. It gives them a whole range of flexibility to add or remove things on or off the list. And then I think this is relevant to what Evan mentioned earlier in terms of why this round of economic or trade negotiation is almost equivalent or parallel to the U.S. Soviet Union arms control negotiation. Part of the reason is because modern warfare, especially between the two nuclear power like the United States and China, is less likely in a direct militarized conflict, but probably we are going to see warfare taking in other domain or war by other means, right? So economic warfare or that directly challenges or undermines countries, not just the U.S. Or China, but also U.S. allies and partners in the region or in Europe, undermines their own sense of economic security. This is going to be probably a more intense area of contention. So export control is a very powerful tool in China's toolkit in terms of challenging or defending itself, but also fighting back.
No,
Mark, can I come in on this?
Yeah, let me just make one comment, then I'm going to come back to you. Then I want you guys to get to Taiwan and we'll take us out here. But also, I would also argue that in direct conflict, potential direct conflict, technology, especially since the first Gulf War, has become the name of the coin of the realm, right? In terms of defense policy or defense, I guess, supremacy. Evan, over to you.
No, I just wanted to reinforce Zoe's excellent point about these new tools that China has at its disposal. Basically, since 2018, the first trade war between the U.S. and China initiated by the Trump administration, the Chinese realized because they sell more to the U.S. than they buy, that they were at a relative disadvantage. So what they started to do in 2018 was build up this extensive new toolkit of what I call, in a new article that I just published 2 weeks ago, precision-guided economic munitions. These are tools like the Unreliable Entities List, the Anti-Foreign Sanctions Law, their weaponization of antitrust investigations, their weaponization of cybersecurity investigations, and then, as Zoe very rightly pointed out, their weaponization of their export controls. And so what you have now is, because the Chinese have a monopoly on the production of so many critical minerals, rare earths, both heavy and light rare earths, being a particular area of concentrated supply for China, the Chinese have been using these, adopting these export controls as a way to manipulate Western access. So, for example, if you're a Western company that produces engines for EVs, there are very particular heavy rare earth magnets you need to produce these engines, and China has a near 90% monopoly on the production of them. So it's really a broader toolkit. Export controls is one of them. But what it does is, in this great negotiation we're going to be having with China, it gives the Chinese, over the short term at least, added leverage, because it means that they can cut off supply of all these critical minerals that, Mark, as you rightly point out, are used in defense production as well. Germanium, gallium, antimony, etc. And so the trade war has really highlighted the massive need for more investment across U.S. allies in these critical mineral areas.
All right, thanks, Evan. Good stuff. We'll have to take a look out for that piece. I'd also add, this is not quite on your point, but CSIS has put out a paper on Korean leverage over the Chinese, in that it's not all one-sided. There are about 27, 28 different raw materials, components, essential elements of, I guess, Chinese production that the Koreans are basically, I think, over a certain percentage. I think it's around 70% or higher in possessing. So interesting stuff there. All right.
Korea possesses a monopoly on exports to China.
A large percentage. Yeah, it's a very interesting piece. Check it out.
I will.
There you go. All right. So last thing, we've got about a minute left. Taiwan. We didn't get to the role of allies, which I wanted to. Too much to unpack here on the China relationship. But Zoe, give us a little bit on Taiwan to take us out. Evan, follow it up, and then we'll gavel down for this episode of Capital Cable.
I think perhaps Western policymakers should not underestimate the Communist Party of China and President Xi Jinping's commitment and resolution to reunite with Taiwan. But the question is at what cost and what is the timing? So I guess I just conclude by saying that perhaps the last piece missing to put President Xi Jinping in the Communist Party of China leadership pantheon, the last missing piece is going to be Taiwan.
All right, outstanding. Evan, final word to you, Taiwan.
I agree with Zoe.
All right, that is it. We're actually hit time right as you ended that sentence. That is amazing. That's never happened before in the Capital Cable, mainly because I go over talking about Korean baseball and my basset.
Like right now, Mark?
Exactly right. So we're at 9:15. I get a minute. So I get a minute to sort of, take us out. So that's the moderator's prerogative. But in all seriousness, thank you, Evan. Thank you, Zoe. Outstanding. We're going to have you back because there's a whole list of things we didn't get to because the discussion was so rich on some of the core elements here. So let's consider this chapter 1. We're going to have you both back for chapter 2. We'll get Victor out of Europe back for chapter 2 as well, where he's on his book tour. Check out the pink book. I'm plugging it shamelessly. Check out Evan's article as well. And Zoe, check out, I would say, her outstanding website on portion of the website on CFR. Lots of interesting material there. So thanks again. Gavel down, and we'll see everybody in 2 weeks. Bye.